Today on the Gifts of Trauma podcast.
That's what I do. That's one of my coping mechanisms. I withdraw, learn to hide. This disability throughout my family life has been essentially invisible.
Congenital myasthenic syndrome is a group of conditions characterized by fatigable muscle weakness caused by an inherited neuromuscular disorder.
But all throughout that time, I had this ability to drop the cane when I was around my family, learn to hide. I could make that disability invisible in front of the people who I needed it to be invisible from, learn to hide.
In 2014, she came across the work of Dr. Gabor Maté with an intention to enhance her professional work as an addictions counsellor and attended a plant medicine retreat led by Gabor the following year.
I experienced in that work just how fear was running my life, and it was a response to the emotional unavailability of my mother. My mind can rationalize anything by calling it a passion or a mission or the work of my heart, but I did too much. As a lead in this retreat, Gabor had stopped me at one point. Now on paper, if you heard this, it may sound harsh, but in interaction and coming from a place of compassion and non-judgment, he says to me, drop your arrogance. He says, not that you're not humble. It's that you think you need to hold it yourself, learn to hide. So you're feeling rage and you're stuck in your rage. And he says, go back to the group and tell them that you're hurting, you're in rage, and you are stuck. So I did.
Rhonda Nelson is a Compassionate Inquiry founding facilitator. She's a registered professional counselor and clinical supervisor. She's also a plant medicine integration specialist. She was part of the core group that took what was originally known as Gabor's style that ultimately became the approach called Compassionate Inquiry.
And this is Rhonda's story of her transformation and her healing through compassionate inquiry. Thanks for being here with us on the Gifts of Trauma podcast. So this is J'aime. Rosemary and I are here today with Rhonda, and it's just a privilege to welcome you here to the podcast.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
So as we're getting started here, I have kind of a big question. What are you here for in this lifetime?
What a beautiful question. To help people open to themselves, which includes me. And that comes so easily for me to say because I've done specific work around my overall intention. And in fact, Gabor Maté's son, Daniel Maté, has a mental chiropractic practice. One of the things that he supports people to do is to develop an intention. So he calls it Walk with Daniel. And so a couple of times I've walked with Daniel and went through a process of inquiry and uncovered this deep intention in me. So, yeah.
I love that you began with the acknowledgement of the inner experience and the inner work that really informs how you move through the world. And that feels like a really good opportunity just to talk about specifically how you came into this work and into this service. Because what you shared with us when we reached out to you was that the exploration of this theme of memories, stories, and beliefs is something that's really near and dear to you. Why is that?
Well, there's actually a point in time that my mind goes to when I think about that. The first time that I came in contact with this work, I was at a workshop where at some point, as Gabor was talking about, this was in the context of addiction. And as he was talking about implicit memory at this day-long workshop, about halfway through the day, as he was talking about that, that's when all of the pieces came together for me. And I could see memory, stories, beliefs. And it got me very excited. The fact that I could see that in myself and see it in also the people that he was working with in a theater setting. It was very motivating, very exciting. And that was my entrance into the deeper, wider lens into myself and other people.
What did you see or hear that struck you as so different and compelling as people were sharing in a certain way that perhaps you'd never witnessed before?
What I saw were people that were sharing very intimate things. They weren't big traumas, although those were, when we talk about capital T traumas or overt trauma, adverse childhood experiences, those were welcome in the space, and they were certainly there as issues that people were dealing with. There were also the small t type traumas in relationship that people were bringing forward. And in me, there was no judgment about the topic or what people were bringing forward. Nobody was made wrong for anything that they were sharing. And I could just see that, seeing without judgment people's experiences, and then turned inward, having that experience for myself. So that was the experience of it. So there was a compassion there that I was in touch with, and a self-compassion. And of course, when we talk about stories, memories, and beliefs, we're also that quality of non-judgment that just seemed, so naturally a part of the process. But for me personally, what I saw was the discussion around implicit memory, how the body shows up and does things that we don't plan for it, we don't intend for it. The body speaks for us.
So, what I want to just invite is, if you're comfortable talking about specifically, what about your memories, stories, and beliefs awakened in perhaps a more compassionate lens than you have perhaps never looked through before as you're sharing? What memories, stories, or beliefs were you holding up to that point of your life that witnessing began to challenge?
First of all, why I was at that workshop to begin with is because I was an addictions counselor working for a public agency at the time. And I'd also been recently separated from my husband, my former husband, who was addicted to drugs and alcohol. And so I went there with the intention to learn more about addiction. And I did walk away understanding more about him, which also informed my work. And also in the process of that workshop, I came across Gabor's book, When the Body Says No. I just got very curious about what my body is saying no to. And before I started reading the book, soon after I got it, I really was using it as a workbook, which then turned into my reason for being there was not about my work, not about my ex-husband, but it was about me. I was born with a neuromuscular disorder. It's called congenital myasthenic syndrome. And it's similar to MS in the symptoms. They're fatigue, muscle weakness. They just happen for different reasons. So much of my life, I've walked with a cane. There is no cure, but there is treatment. And so I've been on treatment. This disability throughout my family life has been essentially invisible. And at the time, I was going through a decade of a process of elimination with testing. Eventually, I ended up at the Mayo Clinic in the States, and I got the correct diagnosis. But all throughout that time, I had this ability to drop the cane when I was around my family. But I always had it in the car. And so all the way up to meeting with them, I'd be using the cane. And when I'm around my family, then I don't use it. I get back in the car. I can barely get out of the car without use of hoisting myself up or walking without use of the cane. So that always was a question for me that was, why do I do that? And am I making this up in my head? Even though all the genetic studies and all of the testing and the years and years of medical visit, I've been hospitalized, but I was questioning myself because of that. During this workshop, Gabor was talking about, and you may recall him talking about this as well, that one day he had a surgery on his leg or his foot, I can't remember. That same day, he goes to visit his mom in the hospital. He's limping all the way down the hallway. As soon as he goes into the bedroom, the room where his mother's in, the limp goes away. He walks straight up to his mom. He visits with her. They have a nice visit. He turns around, he leaves. As soon as the door closes, he's back on in the limp. And so what's happening there is there's this implicit memory that carries a certain belief. For me, that implicit memory was exactly like that. I'd never seen or heard anything like that before. It normalized what my body was doing. I was validated in that. And I came to the realization that this belief that I'd been carrying around was that unless I show up a certain way, I'm not acceptable. And that's the belief that was running the first 40 years of my life. I could make that disability invisible in front of the people who I needed it to be invisible from. So that was very enlightening to me. Soon after that, Gabor played a song called Any Way You Want Me. That's How I Will Be. It was by Elvis Presley. And the tears just flowed. I don't know that I've ever cried like that up to that point, nor since. It was just this mirror of how I had been living my life. And that created an incredible opening for me and a lot of curiosity.
Thank you so much for sharing that story. As you're bringing that up and you're talking about how as soon as you got back into the car, like you could barely get your body to move again, it makes me curious to ask, what were you believing about your pain? What did you discover about how you coped with your pain in relationship to the pain of others?
Well, that my pain would cause others pain. And fundamentally, underneath it all, I made myself wrong for having the pain. And then there's being sorry for it. For example, the way that I used to look after my mom, she's very sick herself, bedridden with rheumatoid arthritis. And so I used to work a full-time job, but during the day before my job would start, I would drive out to her farm 20 minutes away, take care of the dogs, which was very physical. She didn't have a very sophisticated setup, and so it involved carrying buckets of water and food and letting the dogs out and cleaning things. I would do that 3 times a day, in addition to the work that I was doing to make a living. And then at one point, she and my grandmother wanted to go on a holiday, and they can't do that without me because I'm there to look after the dogs. So for whatever reason, I said I couldn't do it. And there was a lot of anger, almost a sense that I'm making something up. So telling myself that I'm not allowed to have pain, I'm not allowed to acknowledge it. I just have to be there. That takes a lot of work and a lot of effort to suppress that. And even as I'm talking about it, I'm nervous about talking about this because this isn't what I do. I don't talk about my story or anything related to it at a certain depth, but I can feel it in my body. I can feel the tension. I can feel what that feels like to be recalling what it was like to live that way and not being able to please those people that I cared about, but who couldn't see me. So taking care of them was more important than me taking care of me.
Taking care of them was more important than you taking care of you. And I heard you also say that they couldn't see you. And that feels so related to what you earlier described as being able to make this condition invisible. And you carry us through this story of how it would actually become invisible in order to be there for them. It's so powerful just to observe how intelligent the body is as we're developing and the strategies that it employs. And so then you're in this experience at the workshop and you come across ultimately this book, When the Body Says No. We have learned that in that experience, you were able to challenge the medication you were on. Can you tell us a little bit about how this personal workbook of When the Body Says No was doing its work through your life at this time and what you saw come of it?
Well, I had learned about just what is it that I was saying no to. And even though I didn't know that at the time, that the story that I'm telling myself is that, as I mentioned earlier, unless I show up a certain way, I'm not acceptable. And I wasn't saying no to that. And so finding ways to hide myself and the shame that comes out of that, even not identifying as somebody with a disability. So that process, the questions that Gabor would inquire of his patients, those are questions that I started asking myself. And it seemed to, just that process of it was very validating, even just being asked the right questions, whether I knew the answers to them or not. The questions themselves were giving me a lay of the land internally. It was releasing in some beautiful ways that I was able to look at what's authentic in me. There was permission to do it by virtue of just asking the question. A type of release in there felt like an opening, and I didn't have an intention. Like I said, the neuromuscular disorder, there's no cure for it, but there is treatment. But I didn't start off thinking that anything was going to change with regards to that. But somehow it's just part of the process. I wanted to experiment with this lightness that I was feeling, seeing if I could reduce the dosage. And I did. I reduced it by 2/3 in that process. So, and that was just before any work with plant medicine.
Rhonda, what I'm hearing as you're talking about this, the turning point came when you began to look inside to yourself. And I'm very curious about what the role was of plant medicine and that what you were able to see, what that showed you.
Yeah. So, because I had this experience, this real internal experience, by the way, in that workshop, now you would think that because if I'm not seen, not just for who I am on the inside, the way I want to be seen, but I'm not seen for the physical that's right point blank there. You would think that the remedy for that would be that somebody else, at least on the outside, would be able to see me. But the transformation that I experienced in that workshop wasn't because anybody saw me. Gabor didn't see me. We didn't even know each other then. The game changer was that I was seeing me in the questions that I was working through in When the Body Says No. I was doing the self-inquiry. I was seeing me. And so this was all an internal process. And so I really was following a calling within me when I came across the plant medicines, because they're not going to be an external thing outside of me seeing me either. This is going to be a really internal process. And so I was drawn to it. And when I arrived at the retreat, the Gabor was leading with ayahuasca in another country. And when I arrived at the retreat, I arrived there on a mule. And so it was depending on my cane. And very interesting that when I look back in my journals, again, coming back to this disorder, it's the CMS there's no cure for it, but there is treatment. So I wasn't looking for a physical healing. And when I look back on the journal, when I first got there, there were two things that I did not want this retreat to be about. The first thing I didn't want it to be about was this disability. The second thing I didn't want this to be about was about my parents. So I'm going to a retreat, a plant medicine retreat, with a guy who wrote a book called When the Body Says No, which is all about health, and who teaches about trauma and childhood trauma. And here I am not wanting this to be about my disability, nor am I wanting it to be about my parents. In the process, in fact, that is what it led me to. This disability, this condition was the invitation for me to come into my body. And what it led me to was not about my parents, but it was about the message that I got, even what this condition was as a response. And essentially, there was intense fear underneath it. I experienced in that work just how fear was running my life. And it was a response to the emotional unavailability of my mother. And she had her reasons, but I got to experience myself as a child, but through the eyes of an adult, that I could see what the root of the disconnect within me was. And more important than anything was that I could be with it. And it really was an extension of, well, let me just say, I went to do that retreat a year after that workshop. And it really was an enhancement of what had transformed inside of me as a result of that workshop. And so 5 days after that workshop, I knew that what I'd learned is that, and actually was experiencing, was that I'm not feeling something and trying to move away from it. I'm feeling it and I'm aware of it. And then in my journal, I had written that maybe awareness and being comfortable with awareness is the piece. And so in that retreat, in the work with plant medicine, I was confronted with deep emotion. It was terrifying at times. I needed help. I learned to ask for help. And my awareness of my experience, that became the facilitator for my healing. And then I learned all about that awareness and how to integrate being with whatever was coming up for me in the moment. And not just being with it myself, but then expanding to, okay, I've got this mirror. I am the mirror. I see myself. Can I allow myself to be seen by others so that when I know and I'm connected to that I need help, can I ask for it? And I did. And there were times that I didn't. And as a lead in this retreat, Gabor had stopped me at one point. Now, on paper, if you heard this, it may sound harsh, but in interaction and coming from a place of compassion and non-judgment, he says to me, drop your arrogance. He says, not that you're not humble. It's that you think you need to hold it yourself. So you're feeling rage and you're stuck in your rage. Go back to the small group, which at that time we were in separate and small groups. And I walked away from the group. That's what I do. That's one of my coping mechanisms. I withdraw, learn to hide. And he says, go back to the group and tell them that you're hurting, you're in rage, and you are stuck. So I did. And there's a release in that. It didn't mean that I wasn't going to have that experience again, but this full abdominal tension, anxiety, dread, rage dialed itself down because I shared it with people who looked at me, who saw me, who heard me, and didn't try to change me.
That just goes to the core of me when I picture in my mind that exchange with Gabor when he says, drop your arrogance. I do appreciate that so much about his capacity to cut straight in and the incredible attunement. It doesn't sound harsh to me. It just sounds like he just shot the most perfect benevolent arrow into the place where it really needed to land. And I'm wondering if you can just tell us a little more about what it was like for you to go back to that small group and to experience that holding. What did that do for you?
Well, it dialed down the intensity of the emotion that I was feeling and the sensations that I was feeling. And the person who was leading that group, one of the other staff, had picked up on that I needed some help. This was towards the end of the retreat. And so essentially, she taught me how to integrate what I was feeling in that moment, which involved really naming what was there. It wasn't so much what anybody did. I think it was in the process, which is almost why it's difficult to put words to it. Between the time that Gabor said what he said and me rejoining the group, there was a decision-making process inside of me. I've got these emotions, and going back to that overall story I tell myself, that unless I show up a certain way, I'm not acceptable. What I normally do with that is I suppress my hurt, my pain, my emotions, not wanting to cause other people pain, not wanting my pain to be painful to somebody else or disruptive. So I have a decision to make. I can feel what I'm feeling and re-engage in these old patterns of reacting to them, or I can try something new. I can take the coaching and try something new. And so I think that the fact that I did that, there's a fire within, there's an energy that really the essence of who we are is the longing of our hearts. And that longing in our heart is the thing that carries us through. I think that's what got engaged for me as I walked back to that group. And then whatever happened in response from the group, that was icing on the cake. But I got connected to something, like you said, that arrow that got shot into me opened something up. I got connected to it, and I was able to make a different decision.
Thank you for sharing. And I'm wondering if I can check in on something. It sounds like a very fluid process where, that began at that workshop with Gabor and then continued through the reading of his book and then went to a different level at the retreat. And the reason I ask this is a lot of people have the impression that plant medicine is very distinctive, but from what you've shared, it sounds as if it was just a natural flow from the cognitive inquiry that was begun at the workshop into the more somatic or body inquiry that was, on almost on the anniversary of the first one, when you went to a different level with a different approach. But it sounds like they were highly compatible. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's just occurring to me now that I'm talking about a medicine retreat, but very little of what I've been saying is included a reference to ayahuasca or the medicine itself. And I think that's the next level. So we're exploring in the mind, and the medicine experience and the holding that very important context gave me the message as somebody who, don't ask for help. And that's true for so many of us. But the message landed, no, help is here and it's available. And so that the context is so important. Giving myself permission to be seen and to be supported to go inward to a somatic level. And that's what plant medicines are, is it's a way to come into the body and to be with the body somatically. In that way, again, it's an opening. That processing and some of the experiences that I shared with you, also with an eye toward integration, helps to keep that somatic processing happening. And in fact, that's what it did. So yes, fluid, it's natural, it's following the wisdom of the body to connect both mind and body.
Thank you. Do you get a sense that reading, when the body says no, was sort of a way to begin engaging and paying attention to your body, that actually sort of was that natural segue to the somatic experience you had at the retreat?
It was a natural segue because, as per the norm, when the mind is perceiving that there's a problem, there is something that is to be fixed. What are these psychological issues that I'm having? Landing on all the right questions, being able to see those questions being utilized. It did go from these questions that compassionate inquiry. I mean, at the time that I'm experiencing all this, the only reference I have to compassionate inquiry is it was affectionately known as Gabor style. And in his books, he called it compassionate curiosity, to see how he was utilizing those questions with a real, his finger on the pulse of people's experiences, as well as his own gut instinct, knowing when to ask what question. There's a poem, I'm going to mispronounce his name, but Piet Hein or Hein, where he says that there's an art of knowing when, never try to guess, toast until it smokes, and then 20 seconds less. That's the essence of it, mind and body. So yeah, when the body says no was a wonderful introduction for my mind to wrap itself around. And then it led me to my body.
So I love that quote that you said was the essence of who we are is the longing of our hearts. I think that really gets back to the original question I asked you about who are you and why are you here? And professionally today, who would have known back in that retreat that you would become one of the founding facilitators of CI? And what would you like to share about the journey out of that retreat space? And was that also a fluid movement for you?
In that experience, when I left the retreat about 6 days later, I was able to put away the cane, and I was able to actually eliminate treatment altogether, and was quite healthy and strong. And my sense of that is that the physical connection that I was experiencing was a manifestation of the emotional healing that I'd experienced at that retreat and as a result of that work. And more importantly, was the result of the integration that I did afterwards. So integration is one of the most important things I think I've ever done in my whole life, because I recognized fear when I felt it, and I knew how to be with it in a way that I didn't know how to be with it before. I experienced my body in a way that I could really enjoy moving and feeling that strong. So then over the years, I went back to that same retreat space, and Gabor had taken a sabbatical from it. And so I joined the team that was there and had been working with him for a decade. And I started to support that process for other retreat attenders, helping them process and then supporting them in their integration afterwards. I'd had my own experience with compassionate inquiry with plant medicine when I'd gone to Peru a year and a half later, and I just saw the absolute depth and felt the invigoration of utilizing my mind during a plant medicine ceremony, doing compassionate inquiry with myself and going deeper and deeper and deeper into the work, which allowed me to explore grief, to experience the difference between suppressed emotion and emotion by itself without suppression. It brought me to self-compassion and to really even being able to be excited and interested in the mundane around self-compassion. And it really got me in touch with some of the deepest parts of me. And actually, I'll just share with you maybe something that I wrote. This was an article that Gabor wrote for Chacruna. And the article is, it says, Deep Ayahuasca Healing and the Truth of Who You Are. And I had sent him, after that particular medicine journey, I had sent something that described that experience. This is about the possibility of liberation, stepping into oneself, becoming ourselves again, or more accurately, as he says, at least remembering at last who we always are. He shares in this article, he calls me Robin in this article. Robin, a woman who since childhood had considered herself disfigured owing to a neurological condition that caused an asymmetry in her visage, found that her beauty is not defined by the configuration of her facial muscles. And then this is what I wrote. Ayahuasca showed me that the deepest point of nourishment in me, what makes me feel alive, is my heart's desire and capacity to connect with people in their dark corners. At the same time, I have the desire and capacity to connect with people from a place of beauty in me, the place in me that allows me to see their bravery, courage, and possibility. I learned that beauty is not a happening or an experience, or even in the smile that I wish for on my face. Beauty is something that is in me, a lens through which I am able to see the world and the people around me. I still want that smile, but the smile is not what would make me beautiful or the thing to rely on to help me express or connect to others. I discovered that the gentlest acts of self-compassion are the greatest asset to connecting to beauty, being empathetic, energetic, and intentional in my own work and in my work with others. So as a result, I just wanted to be a really good therapist. And then compassionate inquiry came along, and I was invited I had done the pilot. There were 6 of us with Satram, 6 of us in the pilot. And a few months later, I received an email asking me to join them as a facilitator. And we were meant to be the first cohort of facilitators. The bulk of the material was there, but the course itself, we just had to make it deliverable to the world. And so the small group of us, there were 10 of us that helped to do that. And it was very exciting because it took me back to, I was a facilitator of compassionate inquiry for myself, first and foremost, in that medicine experience. And so I had the benefit of both mind and body to really get what that was like. Never mind having had the experience through when the body says no. So I could only see good moving forward to create, as Satram has, this structure of the work that Gabor does that then we get to present to the world. So wherever he goes and wherever he's speaking, he can reference, and there will be more and more people who will have access. They have it through his work, through his books, through his YouTube, and through his speaking engagements. But then this affords people an opportunity that I had in the form of that retreat. Not that the CI structure is retreat oriented, but it's some kind of a structure that allows people to see themselves and to be seen. How could I not get excited about that? It was like a dream. Again, we're talking about flow. It was just a very natural flow to me.
Excellent. Thank you. May I just sort of check in on the timeline? The first workshop you went to was what year?
That was November 2nd, 2014.
Okay. And then you've shared with us your path. I'm curious if you're willing to share, what is the state of your physical health now, having been swimming in this soup now for 10 years?
Well, it is a soup. And when I'm not conscious, I fall into patterns. In 2021, I had really overworked myself. And my mind can rationalize anything by calling it a passion or a mission or the work of my heart. It may be all of that, but I did too much and the symptoms reemerged. And so I was walking with a cane for a while. And simply, I just wasn't saying no. There were things that I was not saying no to. The work that I was doing, it was coming at a cost. I just didn't listen. And so symptoms arose, and from time to time, they still arise. Sometimes I need to walk with a cane, sometimes I don't, depending on where I am. I may need a wheelchair. There's weakness in my face still that'll always be there. I want to make the distinction too. This is not an autoimmune disorder. A lot of what Gabor is talking about, he's referring to autoimmune disorders. That means these are disorders that emerge in people. It's a process inside of somebody that develops at some point in their life, usually adulthood. For me, I've had it all my life. The fact that I was born with this and that I have genes for it, and the fact that I experienced the healing that I did, that's just incredible to me. But it's always something that points me to my body. And it always reminds me just to check in.
If I can be a little playful here, you've just reframed the term body check for me. Thank you. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Rhonda, thank you so much for taking us through this 10-year journey. And I'm so happy in this moment of time to truly be celebrating this decade of coming home to yourself and how much that expression is serving first yourself and also us. All of us were able to go through the program, Compassionate Inquiry. And it is really beautiful to hear your story as somebody who was among that first 6 and has witnessed the shaping of it along the way. As you've been speaking about your experience with ayahuasca, I just wanted to share that I live in Costa Rica, very close to where the medicine grows, and of course, other places along Central and South America. So I'm kind of on that track. And your sharing of being able to experience the medicine and be able to hold yourself and apply compassionate inquiry to yourself is something I got to experience after a series of times where I didn't have that tool with me. And it profoundly shaped my experience, my comprehension, and my integration, as you speak of. As we're wrapping up, what would you like to say to the people out there who are curious about how plant medicine or psychedelics in general might serve them? As a person who works as a integration specialist, what do you think is the most important for somebody to consider as they think about and contemplate the journey of plant medicine or psychedelics?
Well, I think to consider that it's not for the faint of heart. I mean, the hardest work that we'll ever do is to look at ourselves. I mean, there's a question in my mind that says, well, why is it so hard? Why is it so hard to look at ourselves? It's not so much, I guess, hard to look at ourselves as it is to be with ourselves, especially when there's fear, when there's terror, when there's shame, anger, and even sadness. Those are difficult emotions to be with. But people have a natural want to be with them. And essentially what the plant medicine is it's a mirror. It's not some external entity that's going to come in and show you and tell you who you are. With the medicine, ingesting it, then it becomes a chemistry inside the body and then a mirror. What that mirror will do is bring you to yourself. For example, if somebody has an intention coming into the medicine space to feel love, they may feel love. They may have that experience of bliss and feeling very loved and very loving. They may also have the experience of what's in the way of that love and connecting to that love. That's what's difficult to look at. And so, as mirror, it gives you that peering into yourself. And it also points you toward the wisdom that is inside of us, which really is greater wisdom than what any person outside of us can impart. Having said that, I don't think any practitioner can stress enough how important the context is. It's not something to be done alone, but it's something to be done where there are trusted facilitators or people who are supporting the work. Because really, if we're talking about it's having no relationship in which trauma can be held. So you could go into a medicine experience, have the experience, and you're alone with it, which would be no different than what it was like in childhood. In that sense, it would be a mirror of your early environment. And so doing something different with it is to experience the trauma, but this time inside of a relationship where it can be held. So as much as, considering the medicine work, it's also considering the context in which to do the medicine work. Having said that, not everybody has access to it, certain legalities or funding or issues as well. And there are lots of modalities out there that can support people to come into their bodies, whether it's yoga or mindfulness movement or different modalities. But you're asking about psychedelics, and in this case, yeah, those are some things to consider.
What I heard you say that brings me back to CI is you could experience it alone, which could feel like you're just experiencing the event again, which is terrifying. Or you could experience aspects of the event that were terrifying and be held. And in CI, what we're always guided towards is being that empathetic, abiding presence that's witnessing and it is there. It is the relationship, can be that relationship for the person who experienced trauma all by themselves. They discover that I was all alone and there was nobody I could tell. So this is the telling. And what I'm hearing from you is that, yes, plant medicine and psychedelics are one avenue to explore. But what I'm really hearing from you is it's the relationship and it's the presence and it's the going through with the experience and being seen. Again, a theme that we keep coming back to is being seen.
Yeah, I've noticed that too, in terms of the theme that keeps emerging in this conversation, and being seen by self and being seen by another.
It really is the heart of the healing process is that we do it together. It's paradoxical, right? That it's so inward and it's so much about you seeing you. That's really what it's about. But also paradoxically, it's being held and being witnessed by another.
Yeah, I go back to my own experience, not knowing that, first of all, what my issues actually were when I came across this work. But there was a process that got started. I was able to start seeing myself, and, the scales start to fall, and any illusions that I was under, they start to, fall away, so I can see something and realize something. And Michael Brown wrote a book called The Presence Process, and he plays on words sometimes to nauseum. And but when he talks about, realizing something, it means that we just see something through real eyes, and that's a start. And that's where I got my start.
Thank you so much for indulging us. And this is the first series of the show, and it's been such an honor for you to join us and to get to know you and to see you, Rhonda. As you said in another show, you have fear, but you also have courage.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for the opportunity.
The Gifts of Trauma is a weekly podcast that features personal stories of trauma healing, transformation, and the gifts revealed on the path to authenticity. Please note, this podcast is for informational purposes only. It is not a substitute for personal therapy or a DIY formula for self-therapy. We'd like to thank you for being here today, and we'd also like to thank our guests, as well as Gabor Maté, Sataram Kaur, and the Compassionate Inquiry admin team, marketing team, and podcast team. Please join us again next week to hear more stories of transformation and healing through Compassionate Inquiry.